Hello everybody, my name is Shailja and I'm going to talk about my research which is on study of dynamic VLAN and implementation for a small business. Coming to the introduction, first I would like to talk about what is the dynamic VLAN and what are the advantages and challenges. Dynamic VLANs, as opposed to static VLANs, do not require the administrator to individually configure each port on the switch, but instead a central server called the radius server. The radius server is used to handle the port configuration of every switch participating on the VLAN network. Radius server is basically used for the authentication, authorization, for accounting while assigning the VLANs to the switch ports. Dynamic VLAN is advanced network methodology that require the additional technology and framework. We use radius servers as well as higher-end Cisco switches for dynamic VLAN implementation. Basics of a dynamic VLAN implementation. Dynamic VLAN implementation with virtual servers is an advanced networking technology. Dynamic VLAN provides an option to logically segment a LAN into many local subnetworks. Management of configuration of dynamic VLAN is automatically performed. We can use a radius server based security system to provide high level of security and privacy of LAN resources. Dynamic VLAN is implemented through the virtual LAN adapters. There are many ways to implement the dynamic VLANs. I did research on third-party tools like DNS3, Packet Tracer, and Radius Server to practice these labs. Dynamic VLAN implementation research statements. I have gone through the Cisco documentation and white papers for the various methods and procedures to deploy switches and routers for the dynamic VLANs. Like what is the configuration required on Cisco Catalyst switches and finding the method to ensure the LAN environment is secure. Finding the appropriate methodologies to reduce a network administration burden with enhanced complexity of networking system with the virtual LAN. Research methodology carried out in this research. Configuring the dynamic VLAN over radius server. Dynamic VLAN is configured over the radius server and free radius tool is used in this case to implement the dynamic VLAN over radius server. To do this following are considered to do. Installing NPS, which is the network policy server for radius authentication. In this server, we define the user privileges and policies. The next is DHCP on Windows Server 2008 or 2012 can be taken. This is basically used to design the IP addresses to the users automatically once it's authenticated by the radius server. And the next one is a switch configuration. Basic switch configuration required to support the dynamic VLANs and configure the radius server IP, add and key on the switch, and client configuration on Windows 10, and connection and authentication. Multiple MAC with single port allocation. In this diagram, single port is allocating multiple MAC addresses from the dynamic VLAN enabled switch. There is one unmanageable switch is connected to 4 workstations and it's connected to port 5 of our dynamic VLAN configured switch, and this dynamic switch is connected to the network backbone. There is a database on Cisco switch with all the workstations, medium access control, the MAC addresses, along with the associated VLAN. This way, essentially, have a VLAN to MAC address mapping. Methodology for implementation. There are many methodologies employed to implement the dynamic VLAN over the radius server. First thing, configuring the Catalyst switch for 802.1x authentication is nothing but we will enable 802.1x authentication on the switch ports. Configuring layer 2 VLANs. This is basically to segregate the layer 2 traffic within the local area network. Configuring the radius server connected to the switchboard. Put the radius server connected switchboard into the particular VLAN so that we can differentiate the traffic between the server and user ports. Configure local user authentication to access switch. Configuring the radius server IP address and key on the switch. Configure switch as a DHCP server. Enable 802.1x authentication on the switch. This is required to support authentication. Configure the PC clients to use 802.1x authentication. Issues of implementation. There are many implementation issues of dynamic VLAN over radius server. Dynamic VLAN implementation is depicted with the given diagram. I too had many issues during the implementation. First thing is transferring the packets to the core backbone network from the LAN segment. There are some configuration issues while doing the LAN segmentation as well. Dynamic VLAN design parameters. In this diagram, basically, there are two Cisco switches which are connected with the 100 megabytes backbone uplink, and dynamic VLAN is enabled on both switches. Each switch has separate LAN network with multiple network segmentations. Each switch will maintain the VLAN, switchboard and MAC address table in order to communicate between the segments. The communication between the segments will happen through the switches. The dynamic VLAN management software. Software components are used to manage the management of dynamic VLAN functions are defined as this diagram explains us what are the components used. We have a router, switch, server, the common gateway for all the network segments and the connectivity to remote branch offices. Advantages of dynamic VLAN implementation. Dynamic VLAN reduces the regular burden of workload of management of hosts. We can distribute network LAN communication over the network. It will be more secure as it's used radius-based authentication for both LAN users and applications. With this thesis, I conclude that dynamic VLAN is more flexible and efficient than static VLAN, but the implementation of dynamic VLANs are more complex. Dynamic VLAN reduces the regular burden of workload of management of hosts and workstations configuration, but initially it gives a lot of burden to the network administrative team to configure and manage the VLAN. The CPU intensiveness of radius server impact the end users of the network by making them unable to assign VLAN during the work overload time of CPU processes of database handling for MAC to IP. Hence, due to the above facts, the network administrator always prefers the static VLAN instead of dynamic VLAN. Here are some of the references. Here are some of the references I've used for this thesis. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for your time. You all have a great day. Thank you.